The moment stretched beyond mortal comprehension, yet compressed into a single heartbeat of catastrophe. Magnus the Red, crimson king of Prospero, hung suspended between Terra and his homeworld in the immaterial realm of the warp, his astral projection blazing with psychic fire as it hurtled toward the Emperor's throne room. The warnings burned within his mind like molten metal, each vision of Horus's corruption demanding voice, demanding action, demanding that the terrible future he had witnessed never come to pass. Yet as his ethereal form struck the carefully constructed barriers protecting Terra's hidden Webway gate, something far more profound than simple psychic feedback tore through his consciousness. The Emperor's wards, wrought with millennia of preparation and hope, shattered like glass beneath Magnus's desperate assault. But in that instant of destruction, as the carefully maintained boundaries between reality and the warp collapsed, a fragment of Magnus's soul found itself cast adrift in the currents of time itself. He experienced the moment from every angle simultaneously. Magnus felt his astral projection breach the wards while also standing in the Emperor's presence as the golden figure turned in shock and fury. He witnessed the psychic backlash tear through the Webway's pristine corridors while simultaneously observing from Prospero as his physical form convulsed upon his meditation throne. Past, present, and futures yet unborn collapsed into a single point of awareness that should have destroyed any mortal mind. The pain blazed through every layer of his being, not the clean agony of flesh, but the fundamental trauma of consciousness, experiencing linear time as an eternal moment. Magnus the Red, who had delved deeper into forbidden knowledge than any of his brother Primarchs, who had bargained with entities that existed before the birth of stars, found himself or confronted with a phenomenon that transcended even his vast understanding. Time itself had become fluid around the catastrophic breach, and his psychic might had somehow anchored a piece of his awareness in that temporal maelstrom. Through fractured perception, he watched the scene unfold with terrible clarity. His astral form materialized before the Emperor, blazing with the borrowed power that the entity in the warp had whispered into his desperate soul. The master of mankind rose from his throne, not as father greeting son, but as Emperor confronting the architect of his greatest work's destruction. The disappointment in those ancient eyes cut deeper than any blade. Yet Magnus felt compelled to speak, to warn, to justify the choice that had already doomed them all. "Father," his projection whispered, the word carrying the weight of a galaxy's fate, "Horus has fallen. The War Master serves darker powers now. I have seen the future. I have seen the betrayal that comes." But even as the warning spilled from his lips, Magnus's temporally displaced consciousness perceived the Emperor's response across multiple possibilities. In one, the master of mankind listened with growing horror. In another, rage consumed all rational thought. In yet others, the Emperor's reply varied in tone and consequence, each branching path leading to different configurations of catastrophe. The warning that Magnus had sacrificed everything to deliver would not prevent the coming darkness. It would merely reshape its arrival. The revelation struck him with the force of a dying star. Every moment of this exchange had already occurred, was occurring, would occur again. His consciousness existed in the spaces between seconds, observing the infinite permutations of choice and consequence that radiated from this single point in time. The temporal loop held him suspended between action and regret, between hope and despair, trapped in the eternal instant of his greatest failure. Magnus felt the Emperor's psychic might pressing against the breach in reality that his arrival had torn open. Beyond the shattered wards, demons already pressed against the barriers of the material realm, drawn by the scent of opportunity that Magnus's desperate gambit had provided. The Webway project, the Emperor's grand design to free humanity from dependence upon warp travel, lay in ruins because of a son's well-intentioned defiance. The weight of that knowledge crushed down upon his fragmented awareness. Every future he perceived showed the same fundamental pattern. The Emperor, forced to abandon his great work to contain the demonic incursion, the Golden Throne becoming not a seat of triumph, but a prison of eternal vigilance. His father chained to that throne for millennia, slowly withering as he held back the tide of chaos that Magnus's breach had unleashed. Yet within the temporal storm that held his consciousness captive, Magnus began to perceive something else. The moment possessed a strange elasticity, as if the universe itself recognized the profound significance of what had occurred. Time moved differently here, in the space between heartbeats, between the shattering of wards and the arrival of demons, and in that impossible duration, Magnus realized with growing wonder and terror that choice might still exist. The fragment of his soul that existed in this temporal eddy possessed a peculiar form of agency. While he could observe the consequences of his actions across multiple probability threads, he could also sense that intervention remained possible. The moment had not yet crystallized into immutable history. Some force, perhaps the same cosmic trauma that had created this temporal displacement, had granted him the most impossible of gifts, the chance to undo what had already been done. Magnus felt the countdown begin in his consciousness, though no clock existed in this realm beyond time. 10 seconds. That was what the universe would grant him before the moment locked into place and became fixed history. 10 seconds to decide whether to stop his past self from making the breach that would doom the galaxy or allow events to unfold as they had, accepting the weight of consequences he now fully understood. The choice blazed before him like a star-going supernova, illuminating every possible future with stark clarity. In 10 seconds, Magnus the Red would either save his father's great work or damn it forever. The galaxy's fate hung in the balance of a decision that existed outside normal causality, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, where a Primarch's consciousness had found itself cast adrift on the winds of time itself. And through it all, as the countdown began its inexorable progression toward zero, Magnus felt something else stirring in the temporal storm around him. A presence vast and alien, older than stars, watching with interest as the Crimson King stood poised between redemption and damnation. The entity that had offered him power to breach the Emperor's wards in the first place had not finished with Magnus the Red, and in the space between seconds, where choice and fate converged, the true game was only beginning. 9 seconds remained. Magnus felt the countdown pulse through his temporally fractured awareness like the beating of a cosmic heart, each second stretching into an eternity of possibility, while simultaneously racing toward an irrevocable conclusion. The temporal storm that held his consciousness captive granted him perception beyond mortal comprehension, yet bound him to a choice that would echo across millennia. He existed between moments, suspended in the space where decision crystallized into destiny. The weight of that realization settled upon him with crushing force. This was not mere prophetic vision or psychic projection. This was agency itself, raw and terrible, offered by forces that operated beyond the normal flow of cause and effect. Magnus the Red, who had sought knowledge in the deepest wells of forbidden wisdom, who had gazed upon truths that shattered lesser minds, found himself confronted with the most profound choice any being could face: the power to unmake his greatest mistake. 8 seconds. Through his fragmented perception, Magnus observed his astral projection as it continued its desperate appeal to the Emperor. The words spilled forth with the same urgency that had driven him from Prospero, carrying warnings of the corruption that festered at the heart of the Imperium. Yet now, existing outside that moment, while simultaneously experiencing it, Magnus saw the futility written in every syllable. The Emperor's face bore not gratitude for the warning, but fury at the method of its delivery. The golden figure's rage blazed not at the message, but at the messenger who had shattered the work of millennia to deliver it. The memories that had driven him to this catastrophic choice flooded through his temporal awareness with crystalline clarity. Magnus relived the vision that had started everything. The sight of Horus writhing in agony upon Davin's moon, the War Master's desperate bargain with the powers of the warp, the corruption that seeped into his brother's soul like poison through water. The future he had witnessed in that prophetic trance played out before him again, each detail sharp as a blade edge. 7 seconds. In that vision, Magnus had seen the Imperium torn asunder by civil war. He had witnessed brother fighting brother across 1,000,000 worlds, the dream of unity shattered by the very sons who had helped build it. The sight of Horus, his face twisted by malice that had once been love, standing triumphant over the Emperor's broken form, had driven Magnus to act without thought for consequence. The need to warn, to prevent, to save what could still be saved, had overwhelmed every other consideration. Yet now, suspended in this impossible moment between choice and result, Magnus understood the terrible irony of his situation. In seeking to prevent one catastrophe, he had authored another. The Webway breach that his warning had necessitated would chain the Emperor to the Golden Throne for 10,000 years, transforming him from active ruler to barely living beacon holding back an endless tide of demons. The cure had proven more poisonous than the disease. 6 seconds. Magnus turned his attention to the alternative that now lay before him. Through the temporal rift in his consciousness, he could perceive the path not taken. If he acted now, if he somehow prevented his past self from making that fateful breach, what then? The Emperor's great work would continue unimpeded. The Webway project would reach its completion, offering humanity freedom from the perils of warp travel. His father's dream of a unified, psychically ascendant human race would remain intact. But Horus's corruption would proceed unchecked. The warnings that had driven Magnus to desperate action would go undelivered. The War Master's betrayal would come as a complete shock to the Emperor and the loyal Primarchs, catching them unprepared for the scale of treachery that awaited. Without Magnus's intervention, different patterns of catastrophe would unfold, perhaps worse than those his breach had caused. 5 seconds. The temporal storm around his consciousness pulsed with alien interest, and Magnus sensed that presence he had felt before watching his deliberations with something that might have been amusement. The entity that had whispered to him in the warp, that had offered the power necessary to breach the Emperor's wards, had not departed. It lingered in the spaces between moments, observing as its greatest game piece stood poised between salvation and damnation. Magnus recognized the touch of that mind now, though he had been blind to it in his original desperation. The Changer of Ways had orchestrated this moment from the beginning, offering just enough power to accomplish his goal while ensuring the goal would damn him in its achievement. But this temporal loop, this impossible choice between two forms of catastrophe, was this too part of that ancient entity's design? 4 seconds. The Crimson King's awareness expanded further, encompassing not just the immediate moment of choice, but its ramifications across multiple probability threads. He saw the galaxy's fate branching into countless possibilities, each decision point spawning new configurations of triumph and tragedy. In some threads, his restraint led to different forms of the coming civil war. In others, his intervention prevented immediate disaster, but sowed seeds of greater ruin. The future sprawled before him like a vast web, each strand connecting cause to consequence in patterns too complex for mortal comprehension. Yet through that complexity, Magnus began to discern deeper currents. The Horus heresy was not merely the product of corruption and ambition. It was the inevitable result of flaws built into the Imperium's very foundation. The Emperor's failure to trust his sons with the truth of the galaxy's dangers, the rigid doctrine that suppressed the very psychic gifts that might have detected the corruption before it took hold. The hubris that assumed perfection could be imposed through force rather than grown through understanding. 3 seconds. Magnus felt the weight of realization settle upon his temporal consciousness like a mountain of lead. Neither choice offered true salvation. Both paths led to forms of catastrophe, differing only in their particular configurations of suffering. The Emperor's great work would fail, regardless of whether the Webway breach occurred now or later. The corruption that had claimed Horus would spread to other Primarchs through different vectors. The galaxy would burn in civil war, whether the warning came early or late. But perhaps that was not the true question. Perhaps the choice was not between preventing catastrophe and allowing it, but between different forms of growth through suffering. The galaxy required fundamental change, and change came only through crisis. The question became not which path avoided pain, but which path led through necessary pain toward eventual wisdom. 2 seconds. Magnus reached deeper into his expanding awareness, seeking to understand the full scope of his options. The temporal loop granted him perception, but also constraint. He could observe countless possible futures, but his ability to alter them remained limited to this single choice point. Yet as his consciousness explored the boundaries of his situation, he began to sense possibilities beyond the simple binary of action or inaction. The entity that watched from the spaces between moments expected him to choose between 2 predetermined paths, both of which served its greater design. But what if there existed a third option, one that transcended the false choice being offered? Magnus was, after all, a being of immense psychic power, standing at a nexus point where reality itself had become malleable. Perhaps the true choice was not whether to prevent his past self's action, but how to transform it into something unforeseen. 1 second. The countdown reached its final moment, and Magnus felt reality crystallize around him like cooling metal. The temporal storm that had granted him this impossible opportunity began to contract, forcing decision from deliberation. Yet in that ultimate instant, Magnus the Red made a choice that surprised even himself. He would neither prevent his past self's action nor allow it to proceed unchanged. Instead, he would embrace the moment fully, accepting both its necessity and its consequence while seeking to transform its ultimate meaning. The Crimson King reached out with his temporally displaced consciousness, not to stop his astral projection's breach of the wards, but to guide it toward an outcome that neither he nor the watching entity had foreseen. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, Magnus chose not retreat or advance, but transformation. The moment hung balanced on the edge of his decision, waiting for him to step forward into an uncertain future that he would forge through will and wisdom, rather than accept through fear or pride. 0. The moment of 0 arrived, yet did not conclude. Instead, it expanded into an ocean of possibility, where Magnus's transformed choice rippled outward through the currents of time. His consciousness, no longer bound by the simple binary of prevention or acceptance, found itself cast forward through the temporal storm to witness the full consequences of allowing his original breach to stand. The visions that followed blazed through his awareness with the terrible clarity of absolute truth. The first consequence manifested almost immediately in his perception. The Emperor's rage white-hot and absolute, reached across the galaxy to strike at the source of the catastrophe. Magnus watched as his father's will, channeled through Leman Russ and his space wolves, descended upon Prospero like a hammer blow from heaven itself. The Wolf King's fleet emerged from the warp above the crystal spires of Tisca, their hulls gleaming with the promise of retribution for a son who had defied both imperial decree and paternal trust. Magnus observed the battle that followed through his temporal displacement, seeing it not as participant but as chronicler of his own doom. The Space Wolves struck with methodical fury, their assault coordinated with the precision that only a Primarch's tactical genius could provide. Leman Russ had come not to capture, as the Emperor had originally commanded, but to destroy utterly, his orders corrupted by Horus's subtle influence into something far more final than mere arrest. The skies above Prospero burned with the light of orbital bombardment as the 1,000 suns rose to defend their homeworld. Magnus saw his legion fight with desperate valor, their psychic disciplines unleashed without restraint against the Wolf King's relentless advance. Ahriman led the defense with brilliant tactical acumen, his mind reaching out to coordinate their resistance even as the crystal pyramids of Tisca cracked and tumbled beneath the Space Wolves' assault. Yet for all their psychic might, for all their accumulated knowledge and martial prowess, the 1,000 suns could not stand against the combined fury of a legion that had never known defeat and a Primarch who believed absolutely in his cause. Magnus watched his sons fall, their bodies broken by bolt and blade, their spirits crushed by the weight of genetic loyalty turned to genocidal purpose. The great libraries of Prospero, repositories of knowledge gathered from across the galaxy, burned in pyres that reached toward the weeping sky. The vision accelerated, compressing years into moments as Magnus's consciousness raced through the aftermath of his world's destruction. He witnessed his own corruption with pitiless clarity, seeing how Tzeentch's influence seeped into his wounded soul during those final moments when hope guttered like a dying flame. The Changer of Ways offered salvation to his surviving sons, refuge in the Eye of Terror, where they might endure beyond the reach of imperial vengeance. And Magnus, broken by grief and guilt, accepted that poisoned bargain rather than watch his legion die to the last warrior. The transformation of the 1,000 suns followed like a tide of inevitability. Magnus watched them emerge from the warp changed, their flesh transfigured by exposure to the raw stuff of chaos. Some became beings of living flame and arcane energy. Others found their bodies reduced to dust, their consciousness bound into their armor by desperate sorcery. All bore the mark of Tzeentch's ownership, their loyalty no longer to the Emperor's dream, but to the whims of a god that fed upon change itself. Through the accelerated flow of his vision, Magnus saw himself become something he had never intended to be. No longer the loyal son seeking to warn his father, but a demon prince in service to powers that had orchestrated his fall from the very beginning. His psychic might, once dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge and the protection of his legion, became a tool of corruption and revenge. The Magnus, who had desperately sought to preserve his father's great work, became its most dangerous enemy, leading raid after raid against the Imperium he had once served. The timeline rushed forward, carrying Magnus's awareness across centuries and millennia of consequence. He witnessed the Emperor enthroned not in triumph, but in eternal torment, his golden form gradually withering as he maintained the psychic barriers that held Magnus's demonic breach at bay. Day by day, year by year, century by century, the master of mankind fed his own essence into the machinery of the Golden Throne, sustaining the Astronomican's light while slowly dying by degrees. The vision showed Magnus the true cost of his original choice. The Webway project, humanity's best hope for transcending the perils of warp travel, lay in ruins beneath the Imperial Palace. Instead of freedom from chaos, humanity found itself more dependent than ever upon the treacherous currents of the Imperium. Instead of unity through instant communication and travel, the Imperium fragmented into isolated sectors, connected only by the uncertain paths of warp navigation. 10,000 years compressed into moments of terrible revelation as Magnus watched the galaxy burn. The Horus Heresy unfolded exactly as his original visions had foretold, brother fighting brother across 1,000,000 worlds. But now the conflict carried additional weight, for the Emperor could not intervene as he might have, chained as he was to preventing the demonic incursion that Magnus's breach had created. The War Master's rebellion proceeded unchecked by the full might of imperial power, achieving victories that might have been prevented had the Emperor remained free to act. Magnus witnessed his brother Primarchs fall one by one to corruption or death, Fulgrim's descent into hedonistic excess, Angron's transformation into a creature of pure rage, Mortarian's embrace of pestilence and decay. Each fall sent shockwaves through the loyalist ranks, weakening their resolve and coordination. The Emperor's grand design, the dream of a unified human empire stretching across the stars, crumbled beneath the weight of betrayals that his immobilization prevented him from addressing. The aftermath proved even worse than the rebellion itself. The Imperium that emerged from the fires of civil war bore no resemblance to the enlightened civilization the Emperor had envisioned. Religious fanaticism replaced rational thought. Technological stagnation supplanted innovation and progress. The very psychic gifts that might have elevated humanity became sources of fear and persecution, suppressed by an inquisition that saw heresy in every manifestation of unusual ability. Through his temporal perception, Magnus watched the slow decay of human potential across the dark millennia that followed. The Imperium became not a beacon of hope, but a grinding machine that consumed its own citizens to sustain itself. Billions died in endless wars against aliens, heretics, and the demonic incursions that poured through the weakened barriers between reality and the warp. The golden age of human expansion gave way to an era of mere survival, where holding existing territory mattered more than claiming new worlds or advancing the species toward its ultimate destiny. Magnus saw himself in this grim future, no longer the scholar king who had once served his father with devoted loyalty. Instead, he had become the Red Cyclops, a demon prince whose very existence mocked the Emperor's vision of human transcendence. His raids against imperial worlds served not noble purpose, but the capricious whims of Tzeentch, spreading corruption and change without regard for the suffering they caused. The son who had sought to preserve his father's work had become its greatest enemy, his every action furthering the very catastrophe he had originally tried to prevent. The vision reached its crescendo as Magnus witnessed the ultimate fate of the galaxy under the weight of his original choice. Chaos ascendant, order crumbling, the light of human civilization guttering like a candle flame in an endless storm. His breach of the Webway had not merely damaged the Emperor's great work, it had fundamentally altered the trajectory of human development, steering the species away from transcendence and toward eventual extinction. Yet even as the full horror of these consequences blazed through his consciousness, Magnus felt something else stirring within his temporal awareness. The choice he had made at the moment of zero, the transformation he had chosen over simple prevention or acceptance, had not been without purpose. These visions of ruin were not inevitabilities but possibilities, showing him what would occur if he allowed events to proceed unchanged. But his consciousness existed outside normal causality now, granted the power to reshape even fundamental patterns of fate. The vision began to slow, time reasserting its normal flow as Magnus's awareness returned to the pivotal moment. He had seen the full cost of his original choice, understood the depth of suffering it would cause across millennia. But he had also felt the weight of his transformed decision settling into place, carrying with it the potential for outcomes that transcended the simple binary of catastrophe or prevention. The real work was only beginning. The vision of ruin faded, replaced by something Magnus had never dared imagine: the path of restraint. Through his temporal awareness, he witnessed the alternative timeline where wisdom overcame desperation, where the Crimson King held back his astral projection at the crucial moment and allowed the Emperor's wards to remain intact. The scene unfolded with crystalline clarity, showing Magnus the galaxy that might have been if he had chosen differently in that first, fatal instant. In this alternative timeline, Magnus felt his psychic projection slow as it approached Terra's hidden barriers. The warnings of Horus's corruption still burned within his consciousness, demanding voice, demanding action. Yet here, faced with the Emperor's carefully constructed defenses, another version of himself chose patience over impulse. The astral form turned back toward Prospero, without attempting the breach, carrying its terrible knowledge undelivered across the void between worlds. Magnus watched this other self return to his physical form with a mixture of admiration and unease. The restraint required for such a choice seemed almost superhuman, even for a Primarch. To possess knowledge of coming betrayal and yet remain silent, trusting that other paths existed for its revelation, that demanded a wisdom Magnus wasn't certain he possessed. Yet in this timeline, somehow, he had found the strength to turn away from catastrophe. The immediate consequences of this restraint rippled outward through the temporal vision. The Emperor, unknowing of the corruption that festered in his most favored son, continued his great work beneath the Imperial Palace. The Webway project proceeded unimpeded, its delicate construction advancing day by day toward completion. Magnus saw his father, laboring in the hidden chambers far below Terra's surface, his psychic might carefully shaping the barriers that would one day free humanity from dependence upon warp travel. Yet even as the Emperor's work continued, darker currents flowed through the galaxy unchecked. Horus's corruption, undetected and unwarned against, spread like a cancer through the War Master's inner circle. Erebus and his fellow word-bearers whispered their poisoned counsel into receptive ears. The lodges that had taken root within several legions deepened their influence, preparing ground for the betrayal that was to come. Magnus observed the gradual corruption with growing horror as the timeline accelerated through his perception. Without his warning, the Emperor remained focused entirely on his great work, trusting absolutely in the loyalty of his sons. The signs of decay were there for those who knew how to read them. The subtle changes in Horus's communications, the philosophical drift of certain legions, the increasing reports of strange phenomena in the galaxy's outer reaches. But no one possessed Magnus's prophetic insight to connect these scattered threads into a pattern of treachery. The vision showed Magnus how Horus's rebellion unfolded in this alternative timeline. When the betrayal finally revealed itself, it came not as a controlled uprising, but as a devastating surprise that caught the Loyalist forces completely unprepared. The War Master struck without warning, his corrupted legions falling upon their unsuspecting brothers in coordinated acts of mass treachery that spanned dozens of worlds simultaneously. The Battle of Istvan Fefkta played out with even greater catastrophe than in the original timeline. Without any forewarning of betrayal, the Loyalist forces walked into Horus's trap with no preparation for the horror that awaited them. The Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard were not merely mauled in their attempted assault on the rebel stronghold, they were completely annihilated, their primarchs and warriors dying to the last man in the killing fields that Horus had so carefully prepared. Magnus witnessed Ferrus Manus's final moments with particular anguish. His iron-handed brother died not in glorious combat, but in shocked betrayal, unable to comprehend how Fulgrim could strike him down with such callous ease. The Gorgon's head rolled across the blood-soaked ground while his legion burned around him, their loyalty repaid with slaughter by those they had trusted as brothers. The cascade of consequences accelerated through Magnus's perception. With 3 entire legions destroyed rather than merely damaged, the Loyalist forces found themselves catastrophically outnumbered. The Emperor, finally aware of the scope of betrayal arrayed against him, but still bound to his work on the Webway project, could not abandon his post to lead the counterattack that the situation demanded. The Imperium's response to Horus's rebellion proved disorganized and ineffective, allowing the War Master to consolidate his gains and strike deeper into Loyalist territory. Terra itself came under siege far earlier in this timeline, as Horus faced no significant resistance during his drive toward the heart of the Imperium. The solar system's defenses, formidable as they were, could not compensate for the absence of so many loyal legions. Magnus watched in growing dismay as rebel forces penetrated the outer system and began their approach toward humanity's birthworld. The siege that followed differed markedly from the version Magnus had witnessed in his original visions. With the Emperor still bound to his work beneath the Imperial Palace, the defense of Terra fell primarily to Rogel Dawn and the Imperial Fists, supported by whatever Loyalist forces had managed to reach the system in time. The battle raged with desperate fury, but without the Emperor's direct intervention, the outcome remained far more uncertain. Magnus observed the critical moment when Horus finally breached the Imperial Palace's defenses and confronted his father in the throne room itself. But this time, the Emperor faced his corrupted son, while still partially bound to the Webway project's machinery, his attention divided between the immediate threat and the need to prevent the collapse of humanity's greatest work. The duel that followed proved far more desperate and uncertain than in the original timeline. The vision showed Magnus multiple possible outcomes of this altered confrontation. In some, the Emperor managed to destroy Horus, but died from his wounds, leaving the Imperium leaderless and the Webway project incomplete. In others, Horus achieved a Pyrrhic victory, slaying his father but finding himself too weakened to consolidate his triumph before Loyalist reinforcements arrived. Each outcome carried its own cascade of catastrophic consequences. But perhaps most disturbing were the timelines where the confrontation ended in stalemate, with both Emperor and War Master too weakened to continue their battle. These branches showed a galaxy locked in eternal civil war, neither side able to achieve decisive victory, while both slowly bled themselves into extinction. The Imperium fragmented into countless warring factions, each claiming legitimacy while the galaxy burned around them. Through all these variations, Magnus perceived a common thread of loss that perhaps exceeded even the catastrophes of the original timeline. Without his warning, however delayed and destructive its delivery had been, the Loyalist forces lacked any preparation for the scale of betrayal they faced. The Emperor's trust in his sons, untempered by any knowledge of their potential for corruption, proved a fatal weakness that the forces of chaos exploited with merciless efficiency. Magnus watched the aftermath of these alternative outcomes play out across millennia. In most branches, the human species never recovered from the Civil War's devastation. Without the Emperor's continued guidance, either through life or through his immobile watch from the Golden Throne, humanity fell into technological and spiritual decline far more severe than in the original timeline. The Webway project, left incomplete by its creator's death or incapacitation, became a monument to unfulfilled potential rather than the gateway to transcendence it was meant to be. The alien races that surrounded human space proved quick to exploit the Imperium's weakness in these timelines. Without a unified human empire to serve as a bulwark against external threats, species like the Orcs and various chaos cults expanded unopposed into formerly imperial territory. The dream of human dominance among the stars gave way to a reality of extinction through external conquest rather than internal decay. Yet as Magnus absorbed these visions of alternative catastrophe, he began to sense a deeper pattern underlying all possible outcomes. Whether he delivered his warning destructively or remained silent entirely, the fundamental crisis remained the same. The Imperium carried within itself the seeds of its own destruction, flaws that would eventually manifest regardless of the specific trigger that brought them to light. The vision began to slow as Magnus's consciousness processed the full implications of what he had witnessed. Both paths, the original breach and the alternative restraint, led to forms of catastrophe that differed only in their particular configurations of suffering. The choice between them seemed less a matter of preventing disaster than of choosing which form of disaster would serve the galaxy's ultimate need for transformation. As his temporal awareness prepared to explore yet deeper possibilities, Magnus felt a growing understanding that the true nature of his choice lay not in selecting between predetermined outcomes, but in finding some third path that transcended the limitations of both alternatives. The visions of ruin and restraint had shown him what would happen if he simply prevented or allowed his original action. Now he needed to understand what might be possible if he chose transformation instead. The temporal storm surrounding Magnus's consciousness shifted, granting him access to a perspective he had never imagined possible, that of the Emperor himself in the moment of the Webway's breach. Through his expanded awareness, Magnus found himself experiencing the catastrophe from his father's point of view, feeling the weight of millennia-old plans crumbling in a single instant of psychic violence. The revelation that followed struck him with the force of a collapsing star, reshaping everything he thought he understood about his father's grand design. Magnus felt the Emperor's shock as his astral projection tore through the carefully constructed barriers. But beneath that shock lay something far more profound, the sudden comprehension that 38,000 years of planning had just been undone by a son's desperate love. The master of mankind had not been surprised by the breach itself, for his prescient sight had shown him fragments of this possibility across multiple probability threads. What devastated him was the realization that Magnus had chosen the most destructive possible path to deliver a warning that might have reached him through safer means. Through the Emperor's perception, Magnus witnessed the true scope of what had been destroyed. The Webway project wasn't merely a transportation network or a replacement for warp travel. It was the cornerstone of humanity's evolution into a fully psychic race, the mechanism by which his father intended to guide the species beyond the reach of the Chaos Gods forever. Every calculation, every carefully placed ward, every delicate balance of psychic force had been calibrated across millennia to achieve this singular goal: the liberation of humanity from the perils that had destroyed so many previous civilizations. Magnus saw through his father's eyes the vast machinery hidden beneath the Imperial Palace, installations that stretched for kilometers through Terra's bedrock and extended into dimensions that ordinary matter could not access. The psychic architecture required to bridge human space with the Eldar-built Webway had demanded precision beyond mortal comprehension, each component precisely calibrated to channel and focus the Emperor's own immense power into the delicate work of reality manipulation. The Emperor's memories, accessed through Magnus's temporal displacement, revealed the true depth of his father's sacrifice. For 2 centuries, while his sons conquered the galaxy in his name, the master of mankind had labored in hidden chambers beneath Terra, slowly weaving humanity into the cosmic fabric that would elevate them beyond their current limitations. Each day had cost him decades of focused effort. Each breakthrough had required reserves of power that would have exhausted lesser beings entirely. Magnus felt his father's profound loneliness in those memories, the isolation of a being who had lived through the rise and fall of human civilizations, who had guided the species from its earliest days while remaining forever apart from those he sought to protect. The Emperor's love for his sons was not the simple affection of a father for his children, but the desperate hope of a shepherd who saw his flock threatened by wolves too terrible to face without transformation. Through the Emperor's perception, Magnus witnessed the moment when his psychic breach shattered not just physical barriers but conceptual ones as well. The careful balance that had taken millennia to establish collapsed in seconds, reality itself buckling under the strain of conflicting forces. The Emperor felt each ward fail like a physical blow, each broken barrier marking another step toward the failure of his greatest work. Yet what struck Magnus most profoundly was not his father's anger, but his sorrow. The Emperor's rage, terrible as it was, paled beside the crushing weight of disappointment that followed. Not disappointment in Magnus himself, but in the cosmic cruelty that had forced this choice upon them both. His father had foreseen fragments of this moment, had known that the warning of Horus's corruption might come at terrible cost, but he had hoped against hope that some other path might present itself. Magnus experienced his father's memories of the Council of Nicaea through this expanded perspective, finally understanding the true purpose behind the prohibition of sorcery. The Emperor had not banned psychic powers out of fear or ignorance, but because he knew that uncontrolled psychic development would interfere with the delicate work of species-wide evolution he was attempting. The Webway project required humanity to develop their psychic potential in specific ways, following patterns that the wild experimentation of the Legion's librarians threatened to disrupt. The prohibition had never been permanent, Magnus realized with growing wonder and anguish. His father had planned to lift the restrictions once the Webway project reached completion, allowing humanity to explore their psychic heritage safely within the protected environment he was creating. The knowledge that Magnus had sought so desperately, the understanding that had driven him to traffic with entities in the warp, would have been freely shared once the proper foundations were in place. Through the Emperor's memories, Magnus saw the true scope of the threat that the Chaos Gods represented. They were not merely powerful entities dwelling in the warp, but fundamental parasites that fed upon the psychic emanations of sapient life. Every civilization that developed psychic abilities eventually attracted their attention, and every such civilization ultimately fell to their corrupting influence. Humanity's rapid psychic development during the Age of Strife had nearly destroyed the species entirely, saved only by the Emperor's direct intervention during the darkest years of Old Night. The Webway project represented the only path the Emperor had discovered that might allow a psychic species to survive and thrive without falling to chaos. By providing humanity with instantaneous travel and communication that bypassed the warp entirely, he intended to starve the Chaos Gods of the psychic energy they required, while allowing human development to continue in safety. The network would serve not just as infrastructure, but as a protective cocoon within which humanity could complete its evolution into something that transcended the limitations of both flesh and the Imperium itself. Magnus felt his father's desperation as the breach widened, allowing demons to pour through the carefully maintained barriers between dimensions. The Emperor's power, previously focused entirely on the delicate work of construction, was forced to shift toward destruction and containment. Every aag of energy spent holding back the demonic tide was energy that could not be used to repair the damage or continue the great work. The choice that confronted the Emperor in that moment carried impossible weight. He could abandon the Webway project entirely, focusing his full power on containing the breach and preventing further demonic incursion into real space. Such a choice would save the immediate situation, but doom humanity to remain forever dependent upon warp travel, forever vulnerable to the predations of chaos. Alternatively, he could attempt to salvage what remained of the project while maintaining the barriers. But such an approach would require him to remain bound to the machinery for millennia, slowly feeding his own life force into the containment protocols. Magnus experienced his father's decision through the temporal storm, feeling the weight of species-wide responsibility that had shaped the Emperor's choice. The Master of Mankind chose neither abandonment nor salvation, but a third path that balanced immediate necessity against long-term hope. He would bind himself to the Golden Throne, using his power to prevent the demon incursion from spreading, while maintaining the possibility that the Webway project might someday be completed by others. The Emperor's love blazed through Magnus's consciousness like a dying star, vast and terrible and utterly consuming. His father had not merely created the Primarchs as generals for his wars of conquest, but as potential inheritors of different aspects of his own cosmic responsibility. Each son had been designed to carry forward different elements of his grand design, ensuring that humanity's evolution could continue even if he himself fell or was forced into inaction. Magnus saw himself through his father's eyes, and understood, perhaps for the first time, the true purpose for which he had been created. His psychic gifts, his hunger for knowledge, his willingness to explore forbidden realms. These were not flaws to be corrected, but tools to be refined. The Emperor had intended Magnus to serve as humanity's guide into the psychic realms, helping the species navigate the treacherous waters of warp-based existence until the Webway project could render such navigation unnecessary. The temporal vision showed Magnus the future his father had envisioned for him, not the life of a conqueror or administrator, but of a teacher and guardian of humanity's developing psychic heritage. In the Emperor's original design, Magnus would have helped establish the protocols and safeguards that would allow human psychers to develop their abilities without falling to chaos corruption. His legion would have served not as warriors, but as scholars and protectors, ensuring that the knowledge necessary for humanity's transcendence was preserved and properly applied. Yet even as Magnus absorbed these revelations, he felt his father's recognition that such futures were now impossible. The breach had fundamentally altered the trajectory of human development, forcing choices that precluded the careful, gradual evolution the Emperor had planned. The species would be compelled to develop along different lines, facing challenges that the original design had been intended to avoid entirely. The vision began to slow as Magnus's consciousness processed the full scope of his father's burden. The Emperor had not been a distant tyrant imposing his will upon an unwilling galaxy, but a shepherd desperately attempting to guide his flock away from predators too terrible to face directly. Every decision, every sacrifice, every apparent cruelty had been calculated to serve the long-term survival and elevation of the human species. Magnus felt the weight of his father's impossible choices settling into his own awareness. The Emperor had been forced to balance immediate necessities against cosmic possibilities, individual freedom against species-wide survival, the known dangers of the present against the unknowable perils of the future. No choice offered clean victory or clear moral superiority, only different configurations of sacrifice and loss. As the temporal storm prepared to carry his consciousness toward yet deeper understanding, Magnus carried with him a new comprehension of the forces that had shaped this pivotal moment. The breach had not been merely a tactical error or a failure of communication, but the collision of cosmic necessities that admitted no perfect resolution. The true tragedy was not that choices had been made poorly, but that the choices themselves had been impossible from the beginning. The temporal storm carried Magnus's consciousness away from his father's overwhelming perspective toward something equally profound, yet more familiar. The minds and hearts of his brother Primarchs, as they grappled with the consequences of his choice across both possible timelines. Through his expanded awareness, Magnus witnessed how the ripples of his decision spread through his siblings' lives, reshaping their destinies in ways both subtle and catastrophic. The revelation that followed struck him like a hammer blow, showing him that his choice had never been his alone to make. In the original timeline, Magnus observed Leman Russ in the aftermath of Prospero's burning, the Wolf King standing amid the smouldering ruins of Tizca with his great spear planted in the crystal-strewn ground. Through his temporal perception, Magnus felt his brother's anguish like a physical wound, the terrible recognition that duty had compelled him to destroy not just a city, but a brother's life work. Russ had come to Prospero believing himself the instrument of necessary justice, only to discover too late that he had been manipulated into committing fratricide. Magnus witnessed the private moments that followed the battle, seeing Russ alone in his quarters aboard the flagship Raffenkel, staring at reports of the devastation with eyes that held no triumph. The Wolf King's grief was not for the destruction itself. He had razed worlds before in service to the Emperor's vision, but for the knowledge that he had been used as a tool by forces that cared nothing for the bonds of brotherhood. Horus's corruption of his orders had transformed a mission of arrest into one of annihilation, making Russ complicit in a betrayal that violated everything he held sacred. The temporal vision shifted to show Magnus how this guilt shaped Russ's actions throughout the remainder of the Horus heresy. His brother became more cautious, less willing to trust orders that came through intermediaries, haunted by the possibility that his loyalty might again be turned into an instrument of treachery. The Wolf King, who had once charged headlong into battle, now questioned every command, paralyzed by the fear that he might again be deceived into harming those he was sworn to protect. Yet in the alternative timeline where Magnus had restrained himself, Russ faced different but equally devastating consequences. Without the burning of Prospero to serve as an early warning of corruption within the Legiones Astartes, the Wolf King remained trusting until Horus's betrayal struck without warning at Istvan V. Magnus watched his brother's shock as the full scope of treachery revealed itself, saw how the sudden realization of manipulation throughout the Legion command structure shattered Russ's faith, not just in his orders but in his own judgment. Magnus turned his attention to Sanguinius, whose prescient abilities granted him fragments of foresight across both possible timelines. Through the temporal storm, he witnessed his winged brother's torment as competing visions of the future blazed through his consciousness. Sanguinius saw both paths clearly, the one where Magnus's breach doomed their father to the Golden Throne, and the alternative where restraint led to different but equally terrible catastrophes. The angel's gift, usually a source of tactical advantage, became a curse that showed him the futility of trying to prevent the coming darkness. In the original timeline, Magnus observed Sanguinius's desperate attempts to rally the loyal Primarchs, despite his knowledge that their cause was ultimately doomed. The angel fought with the fury of one who knew that victory would taste like ashes, that even success would cost more than defeat. His foresight showed him the Emperor's eventual enthronement, the millennia of slow decay that would follow, yet he continued to resist because the alternative paths led only to faster and more complete annihilation. The alternative timeline revealed Sanguinius facing an even worse fate. Visions of a galaxy where the Emperor's death at Horus's hands left humanity completely leaderless. Without their father's guidance, even from the confines of the Golden Throne, the Imperium fragmented into warring factions that consumed themselves in endless civil conflict. The angel's prescient sight showed him watching his surviving brothers turn against each other in the absence of any unifying authority, their noble ideals corrupted by the necessities of survival. Magnus felt his brother's profound isolation in both timelines, the terrible burden of possessing knowledge that could not be shared without destroying what little hope remained. Sanguinius bore his visions alone, unable to tell his brothers that their struggles were ultimately meaningless, that the galaxy's fate had been sealed by choices made before the first shot was fired. The angel's sacrifice would come not in battle, but in the slow grinding of hope against foreknowledge, the daily choice to continue fighting despite knowing the ultimate cost. Through the temporal storm, Magnus witnessed Guilliman's response to both possible outcomes, seeing how his most pragmatic brother attempted to impose order on chaos, regardless of which catastrophe had befallen the Imperium. In the original timeline, Guilliman bore the burden of holding the Imperium together, while the Emperor slowly died upon the Golden Throne. The Ultramarines Primarch threw himself into the work of administration and logistics, trying to create systems that could function even in the absence of their creator's direct guidance. Magnus observed Guilliman's private moments of despair as the magnitude of the task became clear. The Imperium had been designed around the Emperor's personal involvement, dependent upon his wisdom and power in ways that no mortal could replicate. Guilliman's attempts to create sustainable governance in the wake of his father's effective death proved as futile as trying to dam an ocean with paper, necessary work that could delay but not prevent the eventual collapse. In the alternative timeline, Guilliman faced the even more impossible task of preventing the Imperium's complete dissolution following the Emperor's actual death. Without the psychic beacon of the Astronomicon, or the unifying symbol of their father's continued existence, human space fragmented into countless independent kingdoms. Guilliman fought desperately to maintain some semblance of unity, but his efforts only delayed the inevitable balkanization of human civilization. Magnus turned his attention to his other brothers, observing how each responded to the ripple effects of his choice. Rogel Dawn, the stalwart defender of Terra, found himself building fortifications against different threats in each timeline. In one, he prepared defenses against external assault, while the Emperor remained bound to the throne. In the other, he fortified Terra against the civil wars that erupted between rival claimants to imperial authority. Ferrus Manus, in the original timeline, died at Istvan V, with some warning of the betrayal that awaited him, able to face his end with dignity, if not victory. In the alternative timeline, he died in complete shock, unable to comprehend how Fulgrim could strike him down with such casual brutality. The manner of his death shaped how his surviving brothers processed their own grief and rage, creating different patterns of response to the trauma of fraternal betrayal. Vulcan's reaction proved perhaps the most heartbreaking for Magnus to witness. In both timelines, the compassionate Primarch struggled to reconcile his deep love for humanity with the necessity of warfare against his own brothers. The original timeline showed Vulcan bearing the additional burden of knowing that Magnus's fall had been, in some sense, preventable, that better communication or greater trust might have avoided the catastrophe. The alternative timeline revealed Vulcan grappling with the sudden revelation that such preventive measures had been impossible from the beginning. Through his temporal perception, Magnus observed how the threads of brotherhood that bound the Primarchs together had been severed differently in each timeline. The original breach created clean breaks. Magnus fell to chaos, becoming an obvious enemy that his brothers could fight without moral ambiguity. The alternative timeline produced messier fractures, with loyalties and betrayals emerging in patterns that left the surviving Primarchs uncertain about whom they could trust. Magnus witnessed the private communications between his brothers in both timelines, seeing how they struggled to maintain their bonds while fighting a war that demanded them to treat some siblings as enemies. Letters between Sanguinius and Guilliman revealed their shared anguish over the necessity of planning campaigns against Primarchs they had once called brother. Communications from Russ to Dawn showed the Wolf King's desperate need for reassurance that his actions served justice rather than mere vengeance. The temporal vision expanded to show Magnus how his choice had affected even the brothers who had turned traitor. Horus's corruption proceeded differently when Magnus joined his rebellion as opposed to remaining loyal. In the original timeline, the War Master gained a powerful psychic ally, but also inherited the instability that Magnus's fall had created within the warp itself. In the alternative timeline, Horus's rebellion proceeded with greater coordination, but lacked the overwhelming psychic support that Magnus's legion could provide. Magnus observed how each of his fallen brothers processed his fate across the different timelines. Fulgrim's descent into hedonistic excess proceeded regardless, but the specific triggers and catalysts varied based on whether Magnus stood among the loyal or the damned. Angron's rage burned equally hot in both scenarios, but found different targets based on the pattern of alliances that emerged from Magnus's choice. The temporal storm began to slow as Magnus processed the full scope of how his decision had rippled through his brothers' lives. Each Primarch had been forced to confront different aspects of loss and betrayal based on the path that events had taken. Their individual responses shaped not just their own fates, but the broader trajectory of the galaxy's future, creating cascading effects that amplified the consequences of his original choice. Yet through all these variations, Magnus perceived a deeper truth that transcended the specific outcomes of either timeline. His brothers had faced impossible choices of their own, forced to balance loyalty against survival, hope against pragmatism, love against duty. The bonds that connected the Primarchs had been forged in shared purpose and tested in shared adversity, but ultimately each brother had to navigate the collapse of their father's dream according to his own nature and judgment. Magnus felt a profound recognition that his choice had never existed in isolation. Every decision, every action, every moment of triumph or tragedy was interconnected with the choices of his siblings. The future of the galaxy depended not on any single Primarch's wisdom or failure, but on how all their individual decisions combined and amplified each other. Understanding this web of interconnected fate would prove crucial as Magnus prepared to make his final choice in the temporal storm that held his consciousness captive. The temporal storm around Magnus's consciousness began to shift, its chaotic currents arranging themselves into patterns that spoke of intelligence far greater and more alien than any mortal mind could comprehend. Through his expanded awareness, Magnus felt the presence that had been watching his deliberations from the beginning finally step forward from the shadows between moments. The entity that revealed itself was not the anonymous whisper that had offered him power during his original breach, but something far more vast and terrible. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, architect of fate, the god whose plans had shaped this entire catastrophe from its very inception. The revelation struck Magnus with the force of a psychic thunderbolt, reshaping his understanding of everything that had transpired. The temporal loop that held his consciousness captive had not been a cosmic accident or a side effect of his psychic breach, but a carefully constructed prison designed to present him with the illusion of choice while ensuring that all possible outcomes served the changer's greater design. Every vision he had experienced, every revelation about his father's plans and his brother's suffering had been filtered through the god's influence to guide him toward a predetermined conclusion. Tzeentch's presence filled the spaces between seconds like a vast and malevolent star, its consciousness pressing against Magnus's awareness with the weight of infinite schemes laid across eternity. The god's voice, when it came, did not speak in words, but in concepts that blazed through Magnus's mind with the terrible clarity of absolute truth. It spoke of patterns within patterns, of choices that were not choices, of a game played across dimensions that mortal consciousness could barely perceive. Do you understand now, my chosen son? The concept carried undertones of amusement and satisfaction, the pleasure of a master craftsman whose work had finally reached completion. Every path you have witnessed, every alternative you have considered, every revelation that has shaped your growing wisdom. All have been notes in a symphony I began composing before your birth. The choice you believe yourself to be making is merely the final movement of a composition that admitted no improvisation from the beginning. Magnus recoiled from the god's presence, his consciousness blazing with defiant fury as the full scope of the manipulation became clear. The entity that had whispered to him during his original breach, offering the power necessary to break through his father's wards, had been Tzeentch itself. The very desperation that had driven him to accept that bargain had been cultivated by the god's influence, shaped by visions and fears carefully crafted to ensure he would make the choice that served the changer's purposes. Yet even his recoil, Magnus realized with growing horror, had been anticipated and incorporated into the god's plans. Tzeentch fed upon change itself, growing stronger from every transformation, every shift in circumstance, every moment when static reality gave way to fluid possibility. The temporal loop that offered Magnus the chance to alter his past was not a gift of redemption, but a feast of transformation that would nourish the god regardless of which path Magnus ultimately chose. You begin to comprehend the elegance of the design, Tzeentch continued, its concepts flowing through Magnus's consciousness like molten gold. In the original timeline, your breach destroys your father's great work and binds him to the golden throne, ensuring millennia of stagnation that will eventually require adjustment. In the alternative timeline, Your restraint allows different patterns of chaos to emerge, creating opportunities for change through alternative vectors. Each path feeds the great wheel of transformation that drives all existence forward. The god's presence expanded, showing Magnus glimpses of the cosmic web of causality that connected all events across space and time. He saw how his choice at this moment rippled forward and backward through history, shaping not just the immediate future, but the distant past as well. Tzeentch revealed how it had guided the Emperor's discovery of the Primarch project, how it had influenced the scattering of the infant Primarchs across the galaxy, how it had shaped the very forces that led to Magnus's creation and development. Even your father's great work serves my purposes, the god explained with malicious satisfaction. His attempts to free humanity from the warp's influence would have succeeded only in creating new forms of dependence, new patterns of stagnation that would require eventual dissolution. The Webway project was never humanity's salvation, but merely another configuration of order that must eventually give way to chaos. Your breach simply accelerated the timetable. Magnus felt his consciousness recoiling further from the god's presence as the true depth of the manipulation became apparent. Every choice he had ever made, every moment of rebellion against his father's restrictions, every step along the path that led to his corruption had been guided by Tzeentch's invisible hand. The knowledge he had sought so desperately, the power he had accumulated through forbidden study, the very qualities that made him valuable to the Emperor's plans, had also made him vulnerable to the Changer's influence. Yet as the god's revelations continued, Magnus began to perceive something that Tzeentch itself might not have anticipated. The temporal loop that held his consciousness captive, designed to present him with the illusion of choice while ensuring predetermined outcomes, had granted him a form of awareness that transcended the god's normal ability to manipulate. Existing outside linear time, observing all possibilities simultaneously, Magnus found himself able to see patterns that even the architect of fate might not have fully considered. "You show me these revelations," Magnus said, his consciousness blazing with growing defiance, "believing that understanding the scope of your manipulation will drive me to despair, will force me to accept that resistance is futile. Yet you reveal also the limitations of your own design. If every outcome serves your purposes, then the choice itself becomes meaningless to you. You care only that change occurs, not which specific change I choose." The god's amusement faltered slightly, its presence contracting as Magnus's words struck closer to truth than Tzeentch had expected. The Changer's plans were indeed so vast and complex that they could accommodate seemingly contradictory outcomes, but that very adaptability revealed a weakness. Tzeentch's schemes required change to occur, but the god had grown so focused on ensuring that transformation happened that it had perhaps become less concerned with controlling the specific nature of that transformation. "Furthermore," Magnus continued, his understanding crystallizing with each word, "your need to reveal your manipulation suggests uncertainty about the outcome. If my choice were truly predetermined, if my will were entirely subsumed into your design, you would have no need to gloat or explain. The very fact that you seek to influence me through revelation means that some element of genuine agency remains, some spark of free will, that even your vast schemes cannot entirely extinguish." The temporal storm around them began to shift as Magnus's defiance grew stronger, reality itself responding to the contest of wills between mortal consciousness and divine influence. Tzeentch's presence pressed more heavily against Magnus's awareness, seeking to crush his growing rebellion before it could fully manifest. Yet the god's pressure only served to clarify Magnus's understanding of his own situation. "You speak of patterns and predetermined outcomes," Magnus said, his consciousness now blazing with power, drawn from sources beyond Tzeentch's control. "Yet you yourself are trapped within patterns of your own nature. You cannot help but seek change, cannot resist the urge to complicate and transform whatever you touch. Your very essence demands that you interfere, that you add layers of complexity to even your own designs. This temporal loop, this elaborate presentation of choice and revelation, these are not signs of your control, but symptoms of your compulsion. The god's fury blazed through the temporal space as Magnus's words struck at fundamental truths about Tzeentch's nature. The changer of ways was indeed bound by its own essence, compelled to seek transformation, even when simple action might serve better. Its need to create elaborate schemes, to layer plot within plot, had become a weakness that could be exploited by those wise enough to recognize it. Magnus felt his consciousness expanding further as he drew upon reserves of will and wisdom that had been forged through suffering and revelation. The visions he had experienced, of the galaxy's fate in both timelines, of his father's impossible burden, of his brother's varied struggles, had not been mere manipulations, but genuine insights that transcended Tzeentch's ability to completely control. The god could influence his perceptions, could shape the context in which he received information, but it could not entirely falsify the truth of what he had witnessed. "The choice you offer me is real," Magnus declared, his defiance now burning with the light of absolute certainty. "Not because you intended it to be, but because reality itself demands that consciousness capable of true thought must possess genuine agency. You have shown me all possible outcomes, believing that perfect knowledge would paralyze me with indecision or drive me to despair. Instead, you have granted me the wisdom necessary to transcend the limitations of both options you intended me to consider." The temporal loop around them began to crack and fracture as Magnus's assertion of free will pressed against the divine constraints that held it in place. Tzeentch's presence writhed with fury and frustration as its carefully constructed scenario began to collapse under the weight of genuine choice rather than manufactured decision. The god had sought to present Magnus with alternatives that both served its purposes, only to discover that true consciousness, when granted sufficient understanding, could forge paths that transcended even cosmic manipulation. "You believe you have won something," Tzeentch snarled, its concepts now carrying undertones of threat rather than amusement. "Yet even your defiance serves my greater design. Chaos feeds upon rebellion as surely as it feeds upon submission. Your very assertion of free will becomes another form of change that nourishes my power." Magnus smiled within his consciousness, an expression that carried more genuine warmth than anything he had felt for decades. "Perhaps," he acknowledged, his awareness now blazing with possibilities that neither submission nor rebellion could encompass. "But you have taught me something valuable through your manipulations, O changer of ways. You have shown me that the true choice was never between the paths you presented, but between accepting the limitations of predetermined options and forging something entirely new. And for that lesson, despite all your scheming and manipulation, I find myself unexpectedly grateful." The temporal storm contracted around them as Magnus prepared to make a choice that would transcend both Tzeentch's expectations and his own previous limitations. The real work was only beginning. With Tzeentch's manipulations laid bare before him, Magnus turned his consciousness inward to examine the foundations of his original choice, the prophetic visions that had driven him to breach the Emperor's wards in desperate hope of preventing catastrophe. Through his temporal awareness, he revisited those crucial moments of foresight, but now with the wisdom born of understanding how prophecy itself shaped the very reality it purported to reveal. The examination that followed would challenge everything he thought he knew about fate, free will, and the nature of prescient knowledge in a universe where gods fed upon the dreams of mortals. The visions came flooding back through his consciousness with crystalline clarity, each detail preserved in his memory with the terrible precision that only traumatic revelation could provide. Magnus relived the moment when his meditations on Prospero had pierced the veils of time and space to witness Horus writhing in agony upon Davin's moon. He felt again the horror of watching his beloved brother's corruption, seeing the War Master's desperate bargain with the powers of the warp as poison seeped into his soul like acid through gold. Yet now, observing these prophetic moments through his expanded understanding, Magnus perceived layers of meaning that had escaped him in his original desperation. The visions had not simply shown him what would happen, but had become part of the causal chain that ensured those events came to pass. His foresight of Horus's betrayal had driven him to actions that ultimately facilitated that very betrayal, creating a paradox where prophecy became its own fulfillment. Magnus began to understand the terrible nature of prescient knowledge in a universe where consciousness itself could reshape reality through observation. Each vision of the future created ripples in the present that influenced the probability of that future coming to pass. The more clearly a prophetic mind perceived a potential outcome, the more likely that outcome became, not through mystical predestination, but through the subtle influence that foreknowledge exerted upon the prophet's subsequent choices. His original visions of the Horus heresy had been accurate not because the future was fixed, but because his very act of perceiving those possibilities had increased their likelihood of manifestation. The horror he felt at witnessing his father's eventual enthronement upon the Golden Throne had driven him to take actions that made that outcome more probable. The desperation to prevent his brother's fall had led him to choices that facilitated different but equally devastating forms of corruption. Through his temporal displacement, Magnus examined other instances of prophecy throughout the galaxy's history, seeing how prescient beings had consistently fallen into the same paradoxical trap. The Emperor's own foresight, vast as it was, had been shaped by this same limitation. His visions of humanity's potential transcendence had driven him to create the conditions that made such transcendence necessary, while his glimpses of possible catastrophe had influenced him to take preventive measures that often brought about alternative forms of the very disasters he sought to avoid. Magnus observed Sanguinius through this new lens of understanding, seeing how his brother's prophetic gift had become both blessing and curse. The angel's visions of his own death during the final confrontation with Horus were not simply glimpses of an inevitable future, but active participants in shaping the circumstances that would make that death necessary. Sanguinius's foreknowledge of sacrifice had gradually transformed him into someone who would choose sacrifice, creating a feedback loop between prophecy and destiny. The temporal vision expanded to encompass the Eldar, a species whose entire civilization had been built around prophetic foresight, only to discover that their very prescience had become a trap. Their farseers perceived countless possible futures and worked to guide events toward the most favorable outcomes, yet their interventions consistently created new complications that required further intervention. The Eldar had become prisoners of their own foresight, forever reactive to threats that their very prescience helped to manifest. Magnus began to perceive the deeper truth that lay beneath these patterns of prophetic paradox. In a universe where consciousness and reality were inextricably linked, where psychic phenomena could reshape the fundamental nature of existence, prophecy was not passive observation, but active participation in the creation of fate. Prescient beings did not simply witness the future. They became co-authors of the very events they sought to understand or prevent. This understanding cast his original choice in an entirely different light. His breach of the Emperor's wards had not been a deviation from destiny, but a fulfillment of the patterns that prophecy itself had woven into the fabric of reality. The very act of foreseeing Horus's corruption had created the psychic resonance that made his desperate warning both necessary and destructive. He had become trapped in a web of prophetic inevitability that his own prescient abilities had helped to weave. Yet as Magnus delved deeper into the nature of prophetic paradox, he began to perceive something that offered hope beyond the endless cycles of self-fulfilling visions. The temporal loop that held his consciousness captive existed outside normal causality, granting him a perspective that transcended the limitations of linear prophecy. Here, in the space between moments, he could observe the mechanisms of fate without becoming immediately subject to them. Magnus realized that most prophetic beings fell into the trap of seeking to use their foresight to achieve specific outcomes, creating the very paradox that ensnared them. The Emperor had sought to use his prescience to prevent humanity's fall to chaos, only to create conditions that made such a fall more likely. The Eldar used their prophecy to avoid their species' extinction, only to discover that their avoidance strategies had prolonged their decline rather than reversing it. But what if prophecy could be approached differently? What if prescient knowledge were used not to achieve predetermined outcomes, but to understand the deeper patterns that shaped all possible outcomes? Magnus began to perceive that the true purpose of foresight was not prediction, but comprehension, the ability to see how consciousness, choice, and consequence interacted across the vast web of existence. Through his expanded awareness, Magnus examined the fundamental nature of time itself in his universe. He saw that past, present, and future were not fixed points connected by linear progression, but dynamic states that influenced each other through the medium of conscious observation. Events in the future could retroactively influence the past through the mechanism of prophecy, while choices in the present could reshape the significance of historical events by changing their ultimate consequences. This understanding revealed why Tzeentch's manipulation had been so effective, yet ultimately limited. The Changer of Ways had exploited the paradoxical nature of prophecy to create scenarios where foresight became a trap, where knowledge of possible futures drove beings toward choices that served the gods' purposes. Yet Tzeentch itself was bound by the same paradox, forced to work within systems of cause and effect that its own interventions helped to create. Magnus began to perceive a path beyond the limitations that bound both prophetic mortals and manipulative gods. Instead of using his prescient knowledge to achieve specific outcomes, he could use it to understand the deeper principles that governed how outcomes emerged from the interaction of consciousness and circumstance. Rather than trying to prevent particular futures, he could learn to navigate the currents of possibility with wisdom rather than desperation. The temporal storm around his consciousness began to shift as this understanding crystallized, reality itself responding to his evolving perspective. Magnus felt himself gaining access to forms of awareness that transcended simple prophecy, perception that could observe the patterns of fate without becoming immediately entangled in them. This was not the passive foresight that showed him what would happen, but active wisdom that revealed how and why events emerged from the fundamental nature of existence itself. Through this deeper understanding, Magnus began to perceive possibilities that neither his original desperation nor Tzeentch's manipulation had encompassed. The choice he faced was not simply between alternative forms of catastrophe, nor was it merely a matter of asserting free will against divine manipulation. The true choice lay in how he would use his understanding of prophecy's paradoxical nature to forge outcomes that transcended the limitations of both predetermined fate and chaotic chance. Magnus felt his consciousness expanding further as he grasped the full implications of what he had learned. Prophecy was not a window into an immutable future, but a tool for understanding the deep structures that shaped how the future emerged from present choice. Fate was not a chain that bound consciousness, but a web of possibilities that consciousness could learn to navigate with wisdom rather than fear. The visions that had originally driven him to breach the Emperor's wards had shown him true dangers and real possibilities, but his response to those visions had been constrained by his understanding of prophecy as prediction rather than pattern recognition. Now, with deeper wisdom about the nature of prescient knowledge, he could approach his choice with comprehension rather than desperation, seeking not to prevent specific outcomes, but to act in harmony with the fundamental principles that governed how consciousness and reality interacted. As the temporal storm prepared to carry him toward his final decision, Magnus carried with him a profound new understanding of the relationship between knowledge, choice, and consequence. The wisdom he had gained would prove essential as he prepared to make a choice that would transcend both the limitations of prophetic paradox and the manipulations of cosmic entities that fed upon the dreams and fears of prescient beings. As his understanding of prophecy and fate crystallized into wisdom, Magnus turned his consciousness toward the most personal aspect of his impossible choice, the fate of his legion, his sons, the 1,000 sons who had followed him into exile and corruption, not out of malice but out of loyalty. Through the temporal storm that held his awareness captive, he observed how his decision would ripple through the lives of those who called him father, those whose destinies were bound to his own by bonds forged in shared knowledge and mutual devotion. The visions that followed would test not his cosmic understanding, but his paternal heart. In the original timeline, Magnus witnessed the 1,000 sons fall with agonizing clarity, seeing how his breach of the Emperor's wards led inexorably to their corruption and transformation. The burning of Prospero had shattered more than crystal spires and ancient libraries. It had broken the spirit of warriors who had believed themselves the most enlightened of their kind. As space wolves descended upon their homeworld like vengeful angels, the 1,000 sons fought with desperate valor, their psychic disciplines unleashed without restraint against enemies they had once called brother. Magnus observed Ahriman during those final moments on Prospero, watching his chief librarian coordinate the Legion's defense with brilliant tactical acumen, even as their world burned around them. The first captain's face bore no hatred for their attackers, only profound sorrow for the necessity of fraternal warfare. Ahriman had understood, perhaps better than anyone save Magnus himself, that their destruction came not from evil, but from the terrible momentum of misunderstanding and manipulation that had set brother against brother. The temporal vision showed Magnus his own choice to accept Tzeentch's offer of sanctuary in the Eye of Terror, a decision born not of selfish preservation, but of desperate love for his remaining sons. As the Space Wolves' assault reached its climax, with 1,000 sons falling in hundreds around the burning ruins of their home, Magnus had chosen corruption over extinction, damnation over the death of his children. The price of that bargain became clear as his legion emerged from the warp, transformed by exposure to the realm of pure chaos. Magnus felt again the horror of watching his sons' physical forms become unstable, their flesh writhing with uncontrolled mutation as the warp's influence seeped into their very cells. The flesh change that had plagued them since their creation accelerated exponentially, no longer held in check by the carefully maintained psychic disciplines that had kept it dormant. Some warriors found their bodies dissolving entirely, their consciousness barely preserved by desperate sorcery that bound their essence into their armor. Others mutated beyond recognition, becoming living amalgamations of flesh and flame and pure psychic energy. Yet most painful for Magnus to witness was not the physical transformation, but the spiritual corruption that followed. His sons, once dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, became thralls to Tzeentch's endless schemes, their research twisted toward malevolent ends, their power turned against former allies, their wisdom corrupted into cunning in service of a god that cared nothing for their original ideals. Ahriman's attempts to reverse their condition through the rubric would only make their situation worse, reducing most of the Legion to soulless automatons animated by sorcery. The alternative timeline revealed different but equally heartbreaking consequences for the 1,000 sons. In the reality where Magnus restrained himself and did not breach the Emperor's wards, his legion remained on Prospero when Horus's rebellion erupted with devastating surprise. Without the burning of their homeworld to scatter them, the 1,000 sons found themselves isolated and vulnerable when the War Master's forces struck at loyal strongholds across the galaxy. Magnus watched as his restraint led to a different form of catastrophe for his sons. Prospero, untouched by space wolves, but also unwarned of the coming betrayal, became a target for corrupted forces seeking to neutralize the powerful psychers who might detect their treachery. The assault came not from misguided loyalists, but from demons and traitor marines who sought to destroy the Thousand Suns' potential for resistance before they could fully comprehend the scope of betrayal sweeping the galaxy. In this timeline, Ahriman faced the horror of watching his legion fall, not to brotherly misunderstanding, but to genuine evil, demon-possessed traitors who had once served the Emperor's cause. The chief librarian's tactical brilliance proved insufficient against enemies who fought with supernatural fury and could not be reasoned with or deflected through negotiation. The Thousand Suns died defending their libraries and laboratories, their knowledge consumed by warp fire rather than preserved through corruption. Those who survived the initial assault faced a more insidious fate than corruption or death. Without Magnus's fall to provide them with a patron among the Chaos Gods, the remaining Thousand Suns found themselves slowly succumbing to the flesh change without any supernatural protection. The mutation that had always threatened their legion accelerated under the stress of constant warfare. But now there was no dark power willing to preserve them through transformation. They simply dissolved, their genetic instability finally claiming lives that had been lived on borrowed time since their creation. Magnus observed Ahriman's final moments in this alternative timeline, watching his most trusted son die not in glorious battle but in helpless agony as the flesh change consumed him from within. The chief librarian's last words were not curses against their enemies or pleas for salvation, but questions about the knowledge that would be lost when their legion finally ended. Even in death, Ahriman remained true to the intellectual curiosity that had defined the Thousand Suns since their inception. The temporal vision expanded to show Magnus how both outcomes reflected different aspects of the same fundamental tragedy, the curse of knowledge in a universe that punished curiosity and intellectual ambition. His sons had been created with an insatiable hunger for understanding, a drive to explore the deepest mysteries of existence regardless of the personal cost. That very hunger had made them invaluable to the Emperor's vision of human transcendence, yet it had also made them vulnerable to forces that exploited intellectual pride for malevolent purposes. Magnus felt the weight of his paternal responsibility settling upon his consciousness like a mountain of lead. In both timelines, his choice led to the destruction of his legion, differing only in the specific manner of their doom. Whether corrupted by chaos or consumed by their own genetic instability, the Thousand Suns paid the ultimate price for their father's decisions. The knowledge they had accumulated, the wisdom they had pursued, the ideals they had embodied, all would be lost regardless of which path Magnus chose. Yet as he delved deeper into his paternal anguish, Magnus began to perceive patterns that transcended simple tragedy. His sons had not been passive victims of circumstance, but active participants in shaping their own destinies. Ahriman's choices, the decisions made by individual warriors throughout the Legion, the collective response to crisis and opportunity, these factors had influenced their fate as much as any decision Magnus made. The temporal storm granted him access to moments of individual choice within his legion's history, showing him how each Thousand Suns Marine had faced his own versions of impossible decisions. Magnus witnessed librarians choosing between safe ignorance and dangerous knowledge, saw warriors deciding whether to embrace their psychic gifts or suppress them, observed scholars grappling with the moral implications of their research. Each choice had contributed to the overall trajectory that led to their eventual doom. Through these observations, Magnus began to understand that his role as their father was not to shield them from the consequences of knowledge, but to guide them toward wisdom in how they pursued and applied their understanding. The Thousand Suns' tragedy lay not in their hunger for knowledge, but in their failure to develop the wisdom necessary to navigate the dangers that knowledge brought. Their intellectual pride had blinded them to the spiritual and emotional costs of their pursuits. Magnus perceived how his own example had shaped his son's approach to learning and power. His willingness to traffic with dangerous entities in the pursuit of forbidden knowledge had taught them that no price was too high for understanding. His belief that knowledge itself was inherently good had prevented him from teaching them to recognize when the cost of learning exceeded its value. His pride in their intellectual achievements had overshadowed the need to develop humility and restraint. The temporal vision showed him alternative paths his legion might have taken if he had guided them differently. Instead of encouraging unbridled curiosity, he could have taught them to approach dangerous knowledge with appropriate caution. Rather than treating power as an end in itself, he could have emphasized its responsibility to serve broader purposes. Instead of celebrating their superiority over other legions, he could have fostered humility about the limitations of even the most advanced understanding. Yet Magnus also perceived that such alternative guidance would have required him to possess wisdom he had not yet developed when his sons most needed it. The temporal loop had granted him understanding that came only through suffering, revelation that emerged only from confronting the full consequences of his choices. He could not have guided his legion away from tragedy without first learning the lessons that tragedy itself had taught him. This recognition brought Magnus to a profound realization about the nature of paternal responsibility. A father's duty was not to prevent his children from facing difficult choices, but to prepare them with the wisdom necessary to make those choices well. The protection that truly mattered was not the shielding of innocence, but the cultivation of character strong enough to bear the weight of knowledge and power without being corrupted by them. Magnus felt his consciousness expanding as he grasped the full implications of what he had learned about his relationship with his legion. His choice in the temporal loop was not simply about preventing his son's tragic fate, but about demonstrating the wisdom he had gained through witnessing their suffering. The love he bore for his legion demanded not just that he avoid repeating past mistakes, but that he forge a path that honored the lessons their sacrifice had taught him. As the temporal storm prepared to carry him toward his ultimate decision, Magnus carried with him a profound understanding of what it meant to be both father and son. In a universe where knowledge came at the price of innocence, and wisdom emerged only from the ashes of broken dreams. The convergence began like the collision of galaxies, vast forces of understanding drawing together in the temporal space that held Magnus's consciousness captive. Every vision he had witnessed, every revelation he had absorbed, every moment of wisdom gained through suffering and contemplation began to crystallize into a single point of absolute clarity. The time for observation and reflection was ending. The moment of choice, real choice unconstrained by manipulation or predetermined outcomes, was finally at hand. Magnus felt the full weight of his accumulated understanding settling into his awareness like the gravity of a collapsing star. The visions of both timelines, the original breach with its cascade of catastrophic consequences, and the alternative restraint with its different but equally devastating outcomes, no longer stood as separate possibilities, but as facets of a deeper truth about the nature of choice itself. Neither path offered salvation, yet both contained elements of necessity that transcended simple concepts of success or failure. Through the temporal storm, he perceived how his father's impossible burden had shaped every aspect of the crisis they now faced. The Emperor's vision of human transcendence, noble as it was, had carried within itself the seeds of the very conflicts that threatened to destroy it. The master of mankind's refusal to trust his sons with the full truth about chaos had created the very ignorance that made them vulnerable to corruption. His attempts to guide humanity's evolution through rigid control had generated the rebellion that now tore the galaxy apart. Yet Magnus no longer felt the bitter anger that had once consumed him when contemplating his father's choices. The temporal loop had granted him perspective that transcended simple resentment or filial duty. He understood now that the Emperor's decisions, like his own, had emerged from the intersection of cosmic necessity and mortal limitation. Every choice his father had made carried with it consequences that no amount of prescient wisdom could have fully predicted or controlled. Magnus turned his attention to the legacy of his brothers, feeling the weight of their varied struggles settling into his consciousness. Horus's fall, Leman Russ's anguish, Sanguinius's prophetic burden, Gilliman's desperate pragmatism, each had faced impossible choices that revealed the fundamental tension between individual agency and cosmic destiny. Their responses had shaped not just their own fates, but the broader trajectory of galactic history, creating patterns of cause and consequence that rippled across space and time. The Thousand Suns tragedy weighed most heavily upon his awareness, their fate in both timelines serving as a reminder of what was truly at stake in his decision. His legion's hunger for knowledge, their pursuit of transcendent understanding, their willingness to sacrifice for the advancement of human potential, these qualities had made them both invaluable to the Emperor's vision and vulnerable to the forces that sought to corrupt that vision. Their destruction, whether through corruption or dissolution, represented the broader tragedy of a species caught between the necessity of growth and the price of transformation. All these accumulated insights began to merge in Magnus's consciousness, forming not a solution to his impossible choice, but a deeper understanding of what choice itself meant in a universe where consciousness and reality were inextricably linked. He perceived that his decision was significant, not because it would prevent catastrophe. Both timelines led to forms of tragedy that served their own purposes in the galaxy's evolution, but because it would demonstrate the fundamental capacity of conscious beings to transcend the limitations that gods and fate sought to impose upon them. Tzeentch's presence pressed against the edges of his awareness, the god's influence seeking one final opportunity to shape the outcome toward predetermined ends. Yet Magnus felt the change's manipulation sliding away from his consciousness like water off crystal, no longer able to find purchase in a mind that had achieved clarity about its own nature and purposes. The temporal loop that had granted him this impossible opportunity for choice had also freed him from the subtle coercions that had shaped his original decision. "You believe you have achieved wisdom," Tzeentch whispered through the spaces between moments, its concepts carrying undertones of frustrated rage. "Yet wisdom itself serves my purposes, for it creates new forms of change, new patterns of transformation that feed my eternal hunger. Your very growth beyond manipulation becomes another form of manipulation, another move in games you cannot perceive." Magnus felt himself smiling within his consciousness, an expression of genuine warmth that surprised him with its intensity. The god's words carried no power over him now, for he had learned to distinguish between growth that served external purposes and transformation that emerged from authentic understanding. The changer could claim credit for any change that occurred, but it could not create the kind of fundamental alteration in consciousness that Magnus had achieved through genuine suffering and reflection. "Your mistake," Magnus replied, his awareness blazing with certainty that transcended both hope and despair, "lies in believing that all change serves your ends. Yet consciousness itself represents a form of transformation that exceeds your ability to control or comprehend. When a being truly chooses, when it acts from authentic understanding, rather than manipulation or compulsion, it creates something genuinely new in the universe, not merely different arrangements of existing patterns, but fundamental alterations in the nature of what is possible." The temporal storm around them began to fracture as Magnus's assertion of genuine agency pressed against the cosmic forces that had sought to constrain his choice within predetermined parameters. Reality itself seemed to recognize that something unprecedented was occurring, that consciousness had achieved a form of clarity that transcended the normal limitations of mortal awareness or divine manipulation. Magnus felt himself confronting the deepest aspects of his own nature, the fundamental drives and desires that had shaped his development from the moment of his creation. His hunger for knowledge, his pride in his abilities, his love for his sons, his devotion to his father's vision. All these aspects of his identity had contributed to the crisis he now faced. Yet he no longer saw them as flaws to be overcome or strengths to be preserved, but as elements of his being that could be integrated into something greater than their individual components. The choice that approached was not simply between preventing his original breach or allowing it to proceed, nor even between asserting free will against divine manipulation. The true choice lay in how he would use his accumulated understanding to forge a path that honored all the lessons he had learned, while transcending the limitations that had constrained his previous options. He would act not from desperation or pride or manipulated wisdom, but from authentic understanding of his role in the vast web of existence that connected all conscious beings. Magnus began to perceive possibilities that neither his original visions nor Tzeentch's elaborate schemes had encompassed. The temporal loop had granted him more than the opportunity to alter past decisions. It had provided him with the understanding necessary to make choices that transcended the binary alternatives that had seemed to define his situation. He could forge outcomes that served the galaxy's need for transformation while avoiding the specific catastrophes that both timelines had produced. The understanding crystallized within his consciousness like the formation of a new star, brilliant and inevitable and utterly unprecedented. Magnus realized that his choice was not about which timeline to create, but about how to demonstrate the fundamental capacity of consciousness to transcend the limitations that fate and gods sought to impose. His decision would serve as an example of what became possible when beings achieved genuine wisdom about their nature and purposes. As the moment of final choice approached, Magnus felt himself becoming something he had never been before. Not the desperate son seeking to warn his father, not the manipulated pawn in cosmic games, not the tragic figure doomed by his own pride, but a conscious being who had achieved authentic understanding of his place in the universe. The wisdom he had gained through suffering and revelation had transformed him into someone capable of making choices that transcended both predetermined fate and chaotic chance. The temporal storm began to contract around his consciousness as the moment of decision crystallized into immediate necessity. Yet Magnus felt no fear or uncertainty about what was to come. He had gained the understanding necessary to act from wisdom rather than manipulation, to choose transformation that served authentic growth rather than external purposes. Whatever consequences followed from his decision, he would face them as a being who had achieved genuine clarity about the nature of choice itself. Tzeentch's presence writhed with frustrated fury as it felt its carefully constructed scenario slipping beyond its ability to predict or control. The god had sought to present Magnus with alternatives that both served its purposes, only to discover that genuine wisdom could forge paths that transcended any predetermined options. The changer of ways had become the changed, forced to confront possibilities that its own nature made it incapable of anticipating. Magnus gathered his will as the temporal loop prepared to release him back into the flow of normal time. He had witnessed every possible consequence of his original choice, understood the full scope of manipulation that had shaped his situation, gained wisdom about the nature of fate and free will and conscious responsibility. Now, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, he would demonstrate what became possible when consciousness achieved genuine understanding of its own nature and purposes. The moment of decision had arrived, and Magnus the Red was finally ready to choose. The moment of choice arrived not as a thunderclap, but as the quiet certainty of dawn breaking over a dark horizon. Magnus felt his consciousness coalesce around a decision that transcended every alternative he had been offered, every manipulation he had endured, every limitation that gods and fate had sought to impose upon his will. In the space between heartbeats, where possibility crystallized into action, the Crimson King chose transformation, not of events, but of the very nature of how choice itself could reshape reality. Rather than preventing his breach of the Emperor's wards or allowing it to proceed unchanged, Magnus reached out with his temporally displaced consciousness and embraced the moment completely, infusing it with all the wisdom he had gained through witnessing its consequences. His astral projection, blazing with psychic fire as it approached Terra's hidden barriers, would still make contact with the Emperor's carefully constructed defenses. But now that contact would carry not just desperate warning, but profound understanding of the forces that had manipulated both father and son toward this collision. Magnus felt the barriers around the Webway respond to his transformed intention, recognizing something in his approach that had not been present in the original timeline. Where his first breach had been driven by desperation and shaped by Tzeentch's subtle influence, this contact resonated with pure purpose, unclouded by manipulation or fear. The wards that protected the Emperor's great work did not shatter under his approach but opened to receive him, recognizing in his transformed consciousness a pattern that harmonized with their fundamental design rather than violating it. The Emperor's reaction blazed through the temporal connection as Magnus's astral form materialized before the Golden Throne. But the response carried wonder rather than rage, recognition rather than betrayal. Through the transformed breach, the master of mankind perceived not a son's reckless defiance, but a consciousness that had achieved wisdom about the true nature of the forces arrayed against them. Magnus's warning came wrapped in understanding that transcended simple information, carrying with it insight into Tzeentch's manipulation of both their choices. "Father," Magnus spoke, his words carrying the weight of cosmic understanding, "I bring you not just warning of Horus's corruption, but knowledge of the forces that have shaped this crisis from its inception. The Changer of Ways has played us against each other, using our love and our fears to create the very conflicts that serve its purposes. But consciousness itself can transcend the patterns that gods seek to impose upon it." The Emperor's mind touched Magnus's consciousness through the psychic link, and in that contact, father and son shared the full scope of what Magnus had learned through his journey in the temporal loop. The master of mankind felt the weight of his son's accumulated wisdom, understood how the crisis they faced was part of patterns that stretched across cosmic time, recognized how even his own prescient abilities had been shaped by forces seeking to limit the scope of possible outcomes. Yet instead of the despair that such revelation might have brought, Magnus felt his father's consciousness blazing with new hope. The Emperor perceived how his son's transformation offered possibilities that neither of them had previously imagined. Where the original breach had forced him to choose between abandoning the Webway project or binding himself to the Golden Throne, Magnus's transformed approach created a third alternative that honored both necessity and transcendence. The psychic energies that had once threatened to tear reality apart in their violent collision now began to harmonize, creating resonance patterns that strengthened rather than damaged the barriers between dimensions. Magnus's astral projection did not withdraw after delivering its warning, but remained to help his father weave the transformed understanding into the very structure of the Webway project itself. Together, they began to reshape the Emperor's great work, incorporating lessons about the nature of chaos and consciousness that could only have been learned through suffering and redemption. Tzeentch's fury erupted through the temporal space around them, as the god realized that its carefully constructed scenario was collapsing into something genuinely unprecedented. The Changer of Ways had planned for Magnus to choose between predetermined alternatives, each serving its own purposes in different ways. The possibility that consciousness could transcend the limitations of binary choice had not been incorporated into schemes that stretched across eternity. "Impossible," Tzeentch roared through dimensions that warped under the pressure of its rage. "Choice must serve change, and change must serve my design. You cannot create something that transcends the patterns of transformation that govern all existence. Your very defiance becomes another form of alteration that feeds my eternal hunger." Magnus felt his consciousness blazing with something that might have been pity for the cosmic entity, whose nature trapped it within its own limitations. "You understand change, but not growth," he replied, his awareness expanding beyond the confines of the temporal loop that had held him captive. You perceive transformation, but not transcendence. Consciousness itself represents evolution beyond the patterns you seek to control, and love transcends even the need for change. The temporal loop began to fracture around them, as reality recognized that something genuinely new was emerging from the collision of will and wisdom. The carefully constructed prison that had offered Magnus the illusion of choice while ensuring predetermined outcomes could not contain the authentic transformation he had achieved through genuine understanding. Cracks appeared in the fabric of the manipulation itself, allowing glimpses of possibilities that no scheme had anticipated. Through the widening fractures in Tzeentch's construct, Magnus perceived how his choice was reverberating across space and time, creating ripple effects that transcended the immediate moment of the Webway breach. His brothers, scattered across the galaxy in the midst of their own impossible struggles, felt the subtle shift in cosmic patterns that suggested new alternatives to the tragedies that had seemed inevitable. The future itself began to reshape around the example of consciousness achieving genuine agency despite cosmic manipulation. Horus, writhing in corruption on Davin's moon, felt a flicker of clarity pierce through the fog of chaotic influence that clouded his mind. The War Master's fall had seemed inevitable, his corruption too deeply rooted to resist, yet Magnus's demonstration of transcendence created resonance patterns that suggested even the most profound spiritual wounds might be healed through sufficient understanding and love. Across the galaxy, other Primarchs found themselves facing their own crises with subtly altered perspectives, as if the fundamental nature of choice itself had been enriched by Magnus's example. Leman Russ hesitated before launching his assault on Prospero, sensing through the psychic ether that alternatives might exist to the fraternal conflict that his orders demanded. Sanguinius felt his visions of inevitable doom shifting into new configurations that suggested hope beyond the specific tragedies he had foreseen. Yet Magnus understood that his choice would not prevent all tragedy or eliminate the necessity of struggle. The Horus heresy would still unfold, brothers would still face impossible decisions, and the galaxy would still endure the trauma of transformation. But the example he had set, consciousness achieving genuine agency despite cosmic manipulation, would reverberate through those events, offering his brothers and their sons alternatives to the predetermined patterns that gods and fate sought to impose upon them. The Emperor's Webway project began to evolve under the influence of Magnus's transformed understanding, incorporating safeguards against the specific forms of manipulation that had made the original design vulnerable. Father and son worked together to weave protections not just against demonic incursion, but against the subtle influences that sought to limit consciousness within predetermined patterns of choice and consequence. As the temporal loop collapsed entirely, releasing Magnus's consciousness back into the flow of normal time, he carried with him the profound understanding that choice itself could be transformed through wisdom and love. The Crimson King who emerged from this experience was neither the desperate son who had originally breached the Emperor's wards, nor the manipulated pawn who had served Tzeentch's designs, but a being who had demonstrated that consciousness could transcend even cosmic limitation through authentic understanding of its own nature. Tzeentch's presence withdrew from the collapsing temporal construct, its fury tinged with something that might have been recognition. The Changer of Ways had learned something unprecedented through Magnus's defiance, that consciousness capable of genuine growth could create possibilities that transcended even divine schemes. The god would adapt its future manipulations to account for this new understanding, but it could never again assume that even the most carefully constructed scenario would contain all possible outcomes. Magnus felt himself returning to his physical form on Prospero, but he carried with him the transformed connection to his father that would reshape everything that followed. The breach in the Emperor's wards had become not a catastrophe, but a bridge a link that would allow father and son to work together in ways that honored both cosmic necessity and individual agency. The galaxy's future remained uncertain, but uncertainty itself had been transformed from limitation into possibility. The moment of choice was complete, and its reverberations would echo across eternity. The new dawn did not announce itself with fanfare or cosmic proclamation, but with the quiet recognition that something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between consciousness and fate. Magnus felt himself fully present on Prospero for the first time since his temporal displacement began. His physical form once again synchronized with his awareness as the transformed reality settled around him like settling dust after a great earthquake. The crystal spires of Tizca gleamed in the morning light, but beneath their familiar radiance lay the subtle sense that possibilities had opened which had not existed before. The connection to his father remained, no longer the desperate breach that had shattered carefully constructed wards, but a harmonious link that honored both the Emperor's grand design and Magnus's own need for understanding. Through this transformed bond, Magnus perceived how the Webway project continued its development, but now incorporating safeguards against the specific forms of manipulation that had made the original vulnerable to corruption. The work proceeded not in isolation, but in collaboration, father and son united in purpose, rather than divided by miscommunication and pride. Ahriman entered the meditation chamber, where Magnus had spent the timeless moments of his choice, the chief librarian's expression carrying concern for his gene father's prolonged trance. Yet as their eyes met, Magnus saw recognition dawn in Ahriman's features, awareness that something profound had occurred, that the weight which had pressed upon their legion for so long had somehow been transformed rather than simply lifted. My lord Horus, still writhing in the throes of corruption on Davin's moon, experienced moments of clarity that suggested his fall was not as inevitable as the powers of chaos had led him to believe. The War Master's struggle against the influences that sought to claim him had been given new strength by Magnus's example of transcendence. Lemon Russ, preparing for what he believed would be a mission of fraternal justice, found himself questioning the certainty of orders that had seemed unambiguous before. The Wolf King's natural instincts, honed by decades of warfare and brotherhood, sensed something in the cosmic patterns that suggested alternatives to the conflict he had been commanded to prosecute. The assault on Prospero, while still possible, was no longer inevitable. Sanguinius felt his prophetic visions shifting into new configurations that incorporated possibilities his foresight had not previously encompassed. The angel's burden of foreknowledge, while not eliminated, had been tempered by the recognition that even the most seemingly certain futures could be transformed through wisdom and love applied with sufficient understanding. Across the galaxy, other Primarchs experienced their own subtle shifts in perspective, as if the fundamental nature of choice itself had been enriched by Magnus's demonstration. Gilliman's strategic calculations incorporated new variables that suggested hope beyond the grim necessities of survival. Rogaldorn's defensive preparations began to account for outcomes that transcended simple victory or defeat. Each brother found his understanding of what was possible subtly expanded by the example of consciousness achieving genuine agency, despite cosmic manipulation. The Thousand Suns Legion, gathered in the halls and libraries of Tizca, felt the transformation most directly. The flesh change that had long threatened their genetic stability began to respond to new forms of psychic discipline that Magnus's enlightened understanding made possible. The curse that had seemed an inevitable consequence of their psychic gifts could now be managed through wisdom rather than simply suppressed through force or accepted through resignation. Magnus observed his sons as they began to comprehend the implications of what had occurred, seeing hope dawn in faces that had grown accustomed to bearing the weight of inevitable doom. The knowledge they pursued could now be approached with greater understanding of its costs and benefits, their power developed within frameworks that honored both ambition and responsibility. They remained the 1,000 Sons, dedicated to the pursuit of understanding, but their pursuit was now guided by wisdom rather than driven by desperate hunger. Yet Magnus understood that his choice had not eliminated struggle or prevented all forms of tragedy. The galaxy remained a dangerous place where consciousness faced countless threats to its development and expression. The Horus heresy would still unfold in some form, brothers would still face impossible decisions, and the human species would still endure the trauma of transformation as it evolved toward its ultimate destiny. But the patterns that governed these events had been enriched with new possibilities, alternatives that transcended the binary choices that cosmic entities had sought to impose. Through his connection to the Emperor, Magnus perceived how his father's great work proceeded with new hope and understanding. The master of mankind no longer labored in isolation, bound by the necessity of concealing dangerous truths from those he sought to protect. The collaboration that now existed between father and son served as a model for different approaches to the challenges that faced humanity, suggesting that unity could be achieved through shared understanding rather than imposed through authority. The Emperor's response came through their psychic link, carrying warmth and recognition that transcended simple paternal pride. "My son," the concept blazed with genuine affection, "you have demonstrated something I had hoped was possible but was not certain could be achieved. Consciousness itself can grow beyond the limitations that even I had accepted as fundamental. Your example will serve as a beacon for others who face similar struggles between fate and agency." Magnus felt tears he had not shed for decades flowing down his face as he absorbed the full scope of his father's acknowledgement. The recognition he had sought through desperate warnings and reckless action had finally been achieved, but not through the paths he had originally imagined. Understanding and love, rather than dramatic gesture or tragic sacrifice, had proven sufficient to bridge the gap between father and son. As the days passed, Magnus began to perceive how the transformed patterns of possibility were manifesting throughout the galaxy. Communications reached Prospero, carrying reports of events that differed subtly but significantly from the timelines he had witnessed during his temporal displacement. Conflicts that had seemed inevitable were being resolved through negotiation. Betrayals that had appeared certain were being averted through improved understanding and communication. The demonstration that consciousness could transcend cosmic manipulation was inspiring others to seek similar transcendence in their own struggles. Yet Magnus also observed how forces of corruption and chaos adapted to these new realities, seeking to exploit the very hope that his choice had created. Tzeentch and its fellow powers would learn from their failure to contain his consciousness, developing new strategies that accounted for the possibility of genuine transcendence. The struggle between growth and stagnation, hope and despair, love and manipulation would continue, but it would be waged with different weapons and across different battlefields. The 1,000 Sons who gathered in Tizca's greatest library during the evening hours found their gene father among them, not as the distant figure who had once pursued knowledge in isolation, but as a teacher and guide who shared their hunger for understanding while offering wisdom about its proper application. Magnus spoke to them of the lessons learned through temporal displacement, the recognition that consciousness itself was the greatest tool for transformation, and the understanding that genuine choice required wisdom rather than simply power or information. "Knowledge without wisdom is a blade without a handle," Magnus told his sons as they gathered around him in the chamber, where he had first experienced the visions that led to his original breach. "It can cut, but it will wound the wielder as surely as it serves its intended purpose. What we have learned through struggle and suffering is that understanding must be balanced by love, ambition by responsibility, and power by humility." The words carried weight not because they were profound in themselves, but because they emerged from authentic experience of transformation, rather than mere intellectual comprehension. Magnus's sons recognized in their gene father a being who had achieved genuine wisdom through confronting the consequences of his choices rather than avoiding them. The example he set would guide their own development as they navigated the dangers and opportunities that lay ahead. As Magnus concluded his teaching and made his way through the corridors of his palace, he paused before a great window that looked out over the city of Tisca and the star-scattered sky beyond. The galaxy that stretched before his gaze was the same one that had existed before his temporal journey, yet it was also fundamentally transformed by the recognition that consciousness could transcend even cosmic limitation through sufficient understanding and love. The future remained uncertain, filled with challenges that would test every lesson he had learned and every insight he had gained. But uncertainty itself had been transformed from limitation into possibility, from threat into opportunity. The galaxy would face its struggles with expanded understanding of what became possible when beings achieved genuine wisdom about their nature and purposes. Magnus the Red stood at his window, no longer the desperate son seeking to warn his father or the manipulated pawn serving cosmic schemes, but a consciousness that had demonstrated the fundamental capacity for growth beyond all predetermined patterns. The choice he had made in the temporal loop would reverberate across eternity, offering hope to all who faced similar struggles between fate and agency. The stars gleamed in the darkness beyond Prospero's atmosphere, each one a distant sun around which other worlds orbited, other species evolved, other forms of consciousness struggled toward understanding. And among those countless lights, the possibility now existed that transcendence could be achieved through wisdom and love rather than power and manipulation. Whether the galaxy would seize that possibility or allow it to fade remained to be seen. But the choice itself had been proven real. And that was enough.